Hi, students. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the significance of Lucretia in the City of God. Um, I said in class that I think in this sort of vignette in book one, you capture kind of the most significant things about the argument in the City of God generally. And you also capture kind of what is maybe in the long run Augustine's most important contribution and what I find most fascinating about him personally. So it's a kind of complicated setup. It's such a packed text, right? Like, it's not a lot in book one is dedicated to her, but you can kind of see how the themes he sets up and he ends with in book one are intimately involved with this story. Um, but it's an incredibly dense passage. And it also requires a lot of historical knowledge. Now, in class, I told you there's two really important intentions of Augustine's to keep in mind when you read The City of God. The first is that he's an orator, he's a rhetorician, in addition to all the other things he is. So his audience is really important to him. And one part of his audience, of course, is the pagan who blames the Christian for the fall of Rome. But even more importantly, I think, is the audience member who is a Christian, but who is sort of conflating Roman ethics and Roman virtues with Christian ethics and Christian virtues. And this is a big problem because Rome is an honor culture where honor is ultimately unmoored, right, from conceptions of justice, he thinks. And I agree. Because honor doesn't provide its own content. Now, the second authorial intention you need to keep in mind when you're reading is this kind of heart wound of his audience. And I think of Augustine too when you read the Confessions, speaking to that place we have inside us that looks at the state of the world, looks at the suffering in the world and our own suffering, looks at death, and wonders how these things exist with a God that loves us. Book one, it's obvious there's a ton of trauma and suffering that are in the fall of Rome. The fall of Rome and the fall, of man. There's a lot of like valence there for the whole book. Augustine wants to justify the way of God, right? To explain, to give a theodicy, right? Where he can say, God is good, God is all knowing, God is all loving. And evil, right, is a part of life on earth. Both these things can be true, and here's why, right? So, defense of the ways of God and explanation of the problem of evil. Unsurprisingly, then, his big stalking horse in book one is suicide. Suicide for Augustine is extremely unnatural, and what's unnatural is unjust, because it is not only a theological argument that he's making, it's also an argument about the most natural thing, so to speak, is to stay alive, to want to stay alive, to preserve life, and to flourish. And so to take your own life is a very radical strange deformation of nature, right? Of human nature in his framing. However, suicide is central to Roman conceptions of virtue and honor. Um, Honor suicide is a big thing for them, and a lot of their heroes commit suicide. Also, there are suicides of despair that happen um, in or the aftermath or during the sack of Rome. Um, and I don't think it's a stretch to kind of see in the Confessions a depressive tendency in Augustine that makes you think that he himself has wondered about the value of being alive, um, alive for its own sake. Suicide is then this really perverse action because what we seek is being, right? Is goodness. And maybe the biggest significant sign that there is something wrong with Roman culture is that for them, to be virtuous may entail taking your life. That for him is a sign of a sick culture, the way that gladiatorial games are the sign of a sick culture. And I don't think he's moved so much from being judgmental as from trying to console or protect people who may find that to be a solution to their problems or to be what society demands, right, of them. So I mentioned that the Romans that are Christian are kind of very pagan. No one before Augustine, I think, has really made all of the connections that need to be made about how different Christianity is from Rome. A lot of people kind of let it run together, and you see this in some early Christian writers, right, who praise Lucretia for the virtue of chastity. They praise her because she commits suicide after her rape. She's used as a model for widows, actually, who want to get remarried, as kind of like an admonition, like, oh, well, Lucretia was so committed to chastity that she killed herself. So your husband's dead. You should be happy, right? You're not happy, but you shouldn't seek to like get into carnal positions again. It's a sign of something really wrong with you. That's just very messed up to Augustine. And it's the experience of women who are raped in the fall of Rome, right, as a part of the aggression of the enemy. It's their experience and their decision to stay alive and not to commit suicide after the rape that I think causes Augustine to really want to push back on how corrupt Roman values are for Christianity. Because Christians and pagans point at the women who are raped and survive and say that they failed, right? Because they stayed alive. Even Ambrose, his mentor, praises these women who kill themselves to avoid being raped. If you're Catholic and you're familiar at all with discourses around Maria Goretti, Augustine's already handled this discussion. So let's talk specifically then about the story of Lucretia in the predecessor culture and kind of what Augustine does with it. Now I've given you some setup. So let's get into like the meat. Now, one of the things I'm going to argue is that in the course of making this new argument about rape and virtue, Augustine gives us the language of conscience and freedom, right, in a way that still is very important today, is certainly extremely important in his time. So just keep that in mind as we go. Now, here's the Roman account of Lucretia. Lucretia is a beautiful Roman noblewoman who's married to a nobleman of some stature called Tinus. And in a time of corruption and excess, she's unique among noble women because she has a reputation for avoiding scandalous behavior. And like we can talk about that scandalous behavior, how we would judge it now. But I mean, it is the case that the Roman elites are very decadent. I don't think necessarily that we need to make what I'm saying is that the Romans were pretty decadent. So this may not just be a standard argument against women's freedom. It may actually be talking about the decadence of Roman culture and kind of the decadence of their families and their marriages. And so she's unique in this way. And this is a time where, in addition to like the decadence and probably in relation to the decadence, the king of Rome is super tyrannical. He's exploiting the citizens in numerous ways. He is taking them in and sending them to fight wars to fill his coffers, letting their fields lie waste and their children and women starve. So all of these Romans are being exploited for his gain, his financial gain. And it's because he spent so much of the state's treasury anyways, right, that he's doing this in the first place. He's a tyrant. And his son, Prince Tarquin, is the rapist in the story of Lucretia. Like, that makes a lot of sense, right? This tyrannical father having a rapist son, rapist privileged son, I mean, that's like the oldest story in some ways. So Tarquin knows Lucretia, Prince Tarquin knows Lucretia in these circles, and he desires her specifically because she has a reputation of not wanting to engage in sex with men who are not her husband. Her purity, right, is the language that's used. And so she's beautiful to him in the text, but specifically what's desirable about her is that she doesn't want him. And it's a challenge. And it's also an attempt to take something that he sees as good or a type of innocence and corrupt it. He wants corruption of good. So what he does is when Collatinus, her husband, is away at the front, again, you have this sense that a lot of the nobles also don't want to be fighting this war. The prince comes back, he returns from the front, and he's going to claim hospitality rights at Lucretia's estate with her husband gone, because this, he thinks, will be an opportunity to seduce her. And he's taking advantage of the fact that there are very strong norms around hospitality. Um, Hospitality is related to virtue, it's also related to their conceptions of the divine. And so, even if she didn't want to have him there, she couldn't, withhold the hospitality from him. And also, just by being a guest, he's putting himself in a position where she is, in a sense, indebted to him, right? Or having to give things to him. It's a power play. So he tries to seduce her, and she rejects him. And the next thing he does is he says, if you don't have sex with me, I'll kill you, right? So we're here in the territory of rape, right? And then she says, oh, I don't care if you kill me or not. Like, I'm not going to do it. So he takes it a step further because, right, this is about manipulation and about power. And he says, if you don't have sex with me, I will rape you and kill you. But I will also kill a slave and put him in your bed. And I will tell everyone that I had to kill you because I caught you in adultery with a slave. And at that point, she no longer resists him. And I want to be clear that she's not consenting, right? This is obviously force being used on her. The escalation, right, from seduction to a threat of death and then a threat of dishonor is important. I want to focus on it for a little bit. Because the thing that kind of makes her give up hope and just crumble is that he will destroy her reputation. That she'll die, but not only will she die, her memory, her character, it will become the lowest thing, right, that a woman could be in that culture, an adulteress. And she can't handle that. And we can understand, I think, why she couldn't handle that. In her time, her reputation was everything. To lose it would be worse than dying. There's not even at this moment that this story takes place a concept like rape in Roman law, because the idea is that if a woman is raped and she can talk about it, then she wasn't really raped because she survived. A woman who is truly raped would end up dead because she'd resist to the point of death. So it's an extremely perverse culture on this point. Okay, so this is the next part of the story in the Roman tradition. She sends word to her husband and someone named Brutus, who's the founder of the Republic of Rome. And they bring someone with them. So there's a lot of scholars that say by her sending note to these men and telling them to bring someone with them, she's convening a type of quasi-judicial meeting, because the power of the father in the family could make a judgment over her in this type of situation. So she convenes this quasi-judicial moment. And she says what happened. She says, I've been raped by the prince. And she says, next, I'm going to take my life because of it. But I want you to know what happened. And they tell her, don't kill yourself, right? Which is significant because if this is a quasi-judicial thing, they're saying, the norms don't apply, right? In the similar way, basically, we believe you. And she says, no, I have to kill myself because no Roman can use the example of Lucretia to commit adultery, right? Um, and there's this sense that, I mean, of course, again, in their context, rape is physically polluting. There's a sense that the death is a cleanse, the suicide is a cleanse. And even if she's been relieved of the normal social penalty for that, she cannot accept it uh, because she thinks death is the only way out. Now, one of the things she says that's really interesting to get to the point of agency, which is, like I told you, a part of what I think Augustine does in his retelling of the story is deal with agency to a certain extent. She says, it's my job to kill myself, and it's your job to avenge me. She tells the men gathered there. So she thinks that she deserves to die. But she thinks also that she deserves to be avenged. In Roman logic, I guess you could see how these things could be true. And she basically puts the onus on the men to carry out justice. Now, she becomes, her body, like in different stories, her body is carried through the streets by Brutus, and people are outraged by what happened to her. They're outraged by Prince Tarquin's behavior. It becomes emblematic of everything that the tyrant king is, and it leads to the expulsion of Tarquin from the city and the founding of the Roman Republic. So that's how that story wraps up. Okay, I think maybe now, after you've heard the story, you understand a bit more of the complications that arise for a Christian just straight up adopting this as how they talk about virtue, heroism, that kind of thing. So let's turn to what Augustine does with the story. What Augustine does with the story is he first makes fun of the idea that Roman society would expect Lucretia to kill herself if she's innocent, right? So that's kind of the first thing that he attacks is, if you're saying this woman is a hero, right, and you're saying she's innocent and she did nothing wrong, and in fact this is why Tarquin is so evil, then why are you telling an innocent person to kill themselves? That doesn't make any sense. Okay, but then he goes on to say, well, even if she wasn't innocent, and I don't think he's saying this because he doesn't think she's innocent, he's pushing the rhetorical point. Like, even someone who's not innocent shouldn't kill themselves because they can change or they can repent. And also, then you're adding an injustice onto an injustice. If you've committed a sin and then you kill yourself because you're committing a sin, you're kind of just doubling down on sin, in his opinion. The more interesting argument, I think, is his explanation of why Lucretia's rape is a rape. And it centers around the idea of consent. He makes a really big point of saying that Lucretia does not consent to the sexual act, so she cannot be an adulteress. This is extremely radical then. It is extremely radical now in some circles. She, even though, like someone, I could just hear like some internet troll now being like, well, Lucretia did consent to sex with Tarquin, right? She didn't want to be shamed, and so she went along with it, okay? Like, Augustine, like, long time ago, already dispatched of that argument. She is coerced, she can't consent, okay? Because in her heart, she rejects sex with Tarquin. This is the important point, is that whatever happens with her body, and he even gives the example of women who accidentally lose their maidenheads, their hymen, right? Not through a sex act, but through some physical accident. And then they get called, like they're not virgins, right? And he's like, that's insane. Purity, sexual purity, or sexual resistance against resistance against a sexual act, that's an internal quality that has nothing to do with the body. And this is why, you know, he can say that even if she survives her rape, and even if people might judge her as adulteress, internally it's very clear that she did not consent to sex with him, so it is rape for sure. Um, from the perspective of someone who has like a personal history here, I think it's important to push how radical this is. One of the things about rape is that another person is inhabiting your body. It's different from, I mean, all types of unjust coercion are horrible, obviously. And I'm not trying to get into a competition about different types of suffering or trauma. But the thing about rape is that person is inside you. No matter what you are wanting at the moment, it's like they've invaded your body. They aren't just compelling you through external means, they're literally inside. And the sort of loss of freedom that is there in that moment is horrific. How much less free can you get than having someone overtake your body and then enter it? What Augustine does that's so significant is that he acknowledges there's this space in her that can resist even when she's invaded in that way. And that space is her conscience. His argument about conscience is kind of at its full flourishing in this account of rape. How do we know that Lucretia is being raped? We know because of her conscience, because even though her body is overtaken and invaded in this way, dominated and used, her agency is clear and it's strong and it's powerful, and that space is in her control, no matter what else is happening to her. Now, God sees the conscience for Augustine. God therefore knows that she's innocent, when others may not. And here Augustine does something interesting. He mentions, you know, with all types of sin and in questions of like a person's reputation, we have to be very careful because their conscience is a space that's only knowable to God. You can never know it, right? And so your judgments are always limited by that. It's important to accentuate that truth, I think, to him. But here's where the argument takes another turn. He thinks that that space of conscience can be because it is seen by God, it can be a source of strength for someone like Lucretia to stand against her vicious culture and to accept their condemnation, because the only person or the only being whose opinion matters knows the truth, right, about what happened. And that's God, who knows your conscience. And so God's tenderness toward her, his belief of her, these things should strengthen her, should console her, and should prevent her from feeling like she owes her society her death. Pierre Menard, who wrote a great book called Metamorphosis of the City, he spends a lot of time with Augustine there. He calls this the moment in human history or philosophy when conscience is conceived of as the thing that can stand against vicious culture. Augustine thinks it's possible that this part of us is so strong that it can resist whatever perversions or evil are in the world that has shaped us, or in the world that has created us. It allows us to stand up against it. And that's what he wants Lucretia to do. Now, this is where Augustine gets into his critique about honor. He says, well, she's not sinful for her rape, but she is sinful because she couldn't handle the things people said about her. She couldn't handle the shame, and so she killed herself. She's excessively covetous of social honor, according to him. And here I think what he's trying to do, he's not like trying to shit on her. He's trying to make a contrast between her and the rape victims who have survived the sack of Rome and who have not killed themselves, right? He's trying to explain her flaw being one where she loves social honor too much, to, by contrast, elevate these women who are being shat on like by their society with the use of Lucretia's example. Like, you should kill yourself. And a lot of Christians think that too, right? They don't understand why these women are still alive. However, it's also the case that if Roman culture is as perverse as it is on these matters, and if Lucretia grew up in that culture, is shaped by it, formed by it, her conscience is formed by that. And so that freedom that Augustine wants her to have because of her conscience to stand against her social mores, it's not honor. I don't think it's that she's excessively desirous of honor. I think it's despair. She can't live in the aftermath, right? And to deal with the social censure on top of the violation itself would be too much. Now, I suspect that Augustine doesn't go there with Lucretia. Oh, I think he could, right? Talk about, go beyond sort of this throwaway line about honor. I suspect he knows it doesn't just stop there. But then he'd have to deal with something he doesn't really deal with very well in book 1, and he can't. He really needs to be able to get to at least book 14 to handle this aspect of the problem of suicide, which is a version of the problem of evil that he's dealing with in book 1, which is deaths of despair, right? Not deaths of honor, but deaths of despair. Death of despair is harder to deal with than a death of honor, right? And in book 1, there's not the resources to deal with that radical despair that Lucretia would have. But I do think as the book goes on, he is able to talk about that more and have more to say about that. So that's what I would want to communicate to you about the story of Lucretia and the role it plays in the city of God. And I hope you have learned for it and it's given you food for thought.